We're very lucky to have Sam Berens presenting to us today from the School of Psychology. He's got a lot of interesting intersections with the things we are interested in from an AI perspective. So yeah, Sam, take this away.
Thank you very much, Ivor. Thank you very much for having me. For those of you who went to the Sussex AI Day, there is some content in here. Well, it's based off of that talk. That was a brief 10-minute talk. I added extra stuff. This is going to give me a bit more time to discuss the things that I was talking about. So don't worry, I am covering some of the same material, but there is some new ideas, and we can kind of go into things in a bit more detail here. Also, if you do have any questions, please just interrupt me midway, and I'm happy to answer them as we go through. This project, I'm going to start just by acknowledging my PhD student, Sophie, who was leading this project. So most of this is her work. I'm just taking some of the credit for it. And also to say that this project was pre-registered before we kind of collected any of the data, before we analysed any of the data. You can go online, download the pre-registration. We've got Git repos for the tasks and the analysis components. Feel free to go and access them. Okay, so what is all of this project about, and what am I talking about? What's my interest? Well, broadly speaking, my lab is interested in this idea that stems from the late 1990s, Howard Eichenbaum, who kind of suggested something that I thought initially was quite remarkable and very speculative at the time. So it had been known for a very long time that there was this memory system that existed in all mammals, pretty much, so mice, rats, humans, that encodes spatial relationships, and it actually learns spatial maps of a given environment. This work goes back to Tolman in the 60s. This is this has been known for quite a long time. But what Howard Eichenbaum was proposing in this review paper was that actually mammals, what makes mammals smart is that they've co-opted that system that is used to learn spatial relationships for learning non-spatial concepts. And we kind of use it to learn a broad range of things. In this figure, which I think is one of the greatest figures ever been published, is this idea of getting a rat to do transitive inference. So transitive inference is you train an animal or a machine to learn a discrimination, such like A is better than B. It has a higher value or whatever. B is better than C, C is better than D, and so on. And if you train on those adjacent pairs in these little components of a hierarchy, if the animal is smart enough, it can kind of build a hierarchical representation to learn that B is higher in the hierarchy than D. That's all very well and good. It was debated as to whether this was really some sort of proper inferential process at the time. We now know that it is, and that animals can do this fairly easily. But what was remarkable at this point was that the hypothesis was that the way that we're doing these tasks is we're learning a spatial-like relationship of this non-spatial abstract concept. And actually, once we've learned those non-spatial concepts, we kind of like teach this spatial memory system that learns very quickly, can teach it to the rest of the brain, and it can kind of become consolidated in this long-term knowledge. So it's kind of an interesting idea, and since then there has been a fair bit of evidence to kind of suggest that this is the case. This was the first study that really looked at this by Tim Berens' lab in Oxford. And it was a really, really crazy study. So what they got people to do was to learn associations between different types of birds that they artificially made, and different objects, okay? So the birds only varied along 2 dimensions. They had various neck lengths and various leg lengths. That was the only thing that discriminated them. And they were associated with different objects. And what the task involved was getting the participants to morph the neck length and the leg length of these animals, and then say, you've got to recreate the bird that is associated with, let's say, the gingerbread man. Okay, so they were getting participants to do this morphing inside the scanner, or that the participants were kind of passively observing this. And remarkably, what they saw is a signature of spatial navigation that's very, very kind of characteristic of spatial. You can't mistake it for anything else in the spatial memory system, in this region called the hippocampus. Cool. Okay, it's kind of it's an interesting task. I'm not sure how real world is, but it's a really remarkable finding. Specifically, the kind of signal that they were looking for was that we know that when you kind of walk through space, you have these neural populations that actually encode space at regular intervals. So this neural population will fire, it will signal to the rest of the brain that I'm in a hotspot in this particular point. And then I move out of it, it's going to quieten down. If I keep moving, I'll enter a new hotspot. So it's this kind of grid code that tiles the entirety of space. That's what they looked for. It has a 6-fold symmetry. This grid has a 6-fold symmetry. They could identify that. It was kind of pretty crazy. What's that? 5 years after that, there have been a number. These are just 2 examples. This was another group that kind of trained participants again to learn hierarchy with faces. For some reason, neuroscientists really like to use pictures of people in their experiments, and what they got participants to learn was a hierarchy of people in like this. The idea was that you're going into an office space, a new office, and you have to learn who is most popular, who is most competent, and you kind of learn this by betting, doing some sort of kind of betting on who is popular or competent. In this kind of you learn these dyadic relationships across this training. And then, because participants were in their scanner, they could record the activity of the brain activity when participants were looking at these individual faces. And then basically, what they will look for is where the representational distance of those stimuli is kind of scales with the distance in this trained hierarchical space. So what I mean by that is you kind of record a pattern of activity in this region, the hippocampus. You get a record of the representation of that stimulus as that participant is looking at each of these images. And then you compute the correlational or cosine similarity between each of those representations, and you examine whether that correlational similarity scales with this 2-dimensional distance in this two-dimensional competence popularity space. Again, very, very cool, interesting idea. I don't have problems with these. I think they're really great things. But what I wanted to do for this paper, for this project, is kind of see, what is the limits of this? In both of these tasks, there's something such that, participants are kind of coaxed into some relational thinking of the task. What I mean by that is, here you're learning kind of dyadic relationships between pairs of images. So you're kind of being explicitly taught to think about these stimuli as being structured in some sense by learning about those dyads. In the stretchy birds example, it's kind of similar. The participants are being explicitly instructed to morph the neck length and the leg lengths. Maybe that kind of gives some biases in some way to use our spatial memory systems. Yeah.
Just a quick question on the one on the right with the faces. Is there an issue of kind of human bias in particular types of faces which might cause some difficulties, that kind of study? Because I guess with the birds it's a bit more abstract.
Yes. Yeah, it's definitely the case. What they did was they made, I think that this is true, they randomize, I'm sure that this is true, they randomize the faces across the different levels of the hierarchy to account for that. So yeah, there was some control for that, but that definitely has a very large effect. I've seen in other studies that in some more studies that hasn't had large effect.
Why would they choose to use faces rather than?
There is, I think, a misguided hypothesis that humans are very, very good at learning about faces because they're intrinsically social. So if you get people to learn a hierarchy of these faces, they learn them very, very rapidly. If you replace those face images with another set of stimuli, such as abstract, unusual sea creatures, then they're much slower at learning them. And the working hypothesis amongst most people is that it's because they're social stimuli that people are learning those. I don't think that's true. I think that we have, this is kind of a side project, another project, but one of the other pieces of work that Sophie and I are working on at the moment is investigating this idea that visual dissimilarity in, say, the visual cortex actually feeds into these higher order brain regions and helps you separate them out. You can see that trivially in an artificial neural network. Like an artificial neural network that starts has a very, it separates two representations very strongly before it's been trained. It's going to be faster at learning a discrimination between those two. I think that's what's going on. I don't think it's anything to do with the social aspect, but basically faces are important to people, and that's why they're often used. Okay, so this is the evidence. As I say, we're not quite sure. From my perspective, I'm not quite sure how much these results can be extended to other tasks and things like this. In addition to all of that, we've got now neural networks that can learn these structures. They can learn abstract conceptual spaces just in the same way as they can learn physical spaces. Most noticeably, the transformer architecture has kind of been studied in this regard of learning structures. This is an example that just as a quick side note here. This group that actually worked with this stretchy bird study, they had an existing model of how this hippocampal memory system in this area was kind of learning these abstract conceptual structures. And it was a neural model that it was very much centered, kind of directed towards the neuroscience community. It was a handcrafted model of how these representations are learned at a computational level. All very, very well and good. In 2021, when there was a lot of hype around transformers kind of bubbling up, they published a paper suggesting that actually their model was very, very similar to the transformer architecture. And actually all that you needed to do was modify the transformer architecture in a small way, add a little bit of recurrency, and you essentially recreate their pre-existing model that it describes how these non-spatial structures are learned. When I first heard this, I thought that this is kind of just a bit of jumping on the hype bandwagon, but it is genuinely true that it works, it checks out, and I believe that this is a good analogy to make, that actually pre-existing models that we have of the hippocampal system, with some modification, you can kind of get to the transformer architecture and vice versa. Yes.
Quick question on that. Isn't that just because the standard similarity in transformers is the cosine similarity?
No, it's more. It's very much to do with the computational structure and this idea of how I guess you're separating. So traditional neural networks in memory research haven't really separated the way that the keys that, or the cues that retrieve memory, the keys in a transformer, from the content of memory. So they confound those two things, and your memory system becomes really limited. So for instance, what I mean by that is, if I am trying to remember what I had for breakfast this morning, I've got to have an input to the network that is in some way similar to this morning, like it's a partial input and it retrieves the full input from that. Transformers explicitly dissociate the memory contents from the cues with this key value system. And that's the fundamental reason why the transformer architecture is thought to be a good model of the hippocampal system, that dissociation. There's another really good review article about key value memory systems in the brain, and how there's a Sam Gershman in the US has published a really nice article saying, oh, the transformer was invented like 40 years ago by neuroscientists. I don't know about that, but it's a good point that there is, you know, kind of, and he wouldn't put it in those words. I'm sure he wouldn't. This is going to be recorded, so. So, okay. Transformers, though, they have been studied in different contexts. So, and we know that they learn structures. This is a particular study from Power et al. 2022. You might have come across it before, that kind of described this grokking phenomenon. Iber was the first person who cottoned me onto this idea, and suggested that it would be a good thing to look at. What the authors did was they trained a very simple, small group of transformers on various modular arithmetic tasks. So they trained it on modular addition, modular division. Some of them, the problems varied in different sizes. And they observed, well, the first thing is kind of not too surprising. You can find representations in those networks that kind of reflect the modular structure of the task. So this is a small network trained on modular division, on integer division mod 8. And what you'll see is that these are, let me remember what this is. I think these are the embeddings of the inputs on the final layer before they go to like the softmax, I think. I can't remember exactly. But what you'll see is that those inputs are arranged modularly. So you've got, this is it's a t-SNE of those embeddings. So you've got 1 over here, 0 over here, I should start there. 0 over there, and then 1, and then 2 over here, and then 3, 4. So it's got this fourfold symmetry. Now you might think, why fourfold for 8? Well, it's because it's the network has divided it into its prime subfields. So it's kind of learnt that actually, you know, the integer division mod 8 isn't you know, 8 is not a prime. It's kind of divided it into two kind of not even prime, but into two smaller problems, which these networks often do. And it's got this kind of fourfold symmetry. Now, what the paper really illustrated, and the whole point of this paper, which is interesting, is this grokking effect. So this grokking effect was observed and has been better described now since this paper was published, was where, you know, let's say you train on 70% of all of the possible modular addition problems that you possibly could. You explicitly train on that 70%, and to test the network, you generalize it on, you test its generalization to that remaining 30% that's held out. Okay. What you see is that the network very, very rapidly in training, its training performance gets to ceiling very quickly. Like it memorizes those problems extremely quickly, but there's this very long period where it was actually, I think, only discovered by chance, because one of the researchers left the training room going for when they went away, where like it's only after, you know, a very long period of steps where it looks like the network's not learning anything. Certainly performance not going up, the gradient is flat, like there's nothing happening, the network weights is not really changing very much. All of a sudden you gonna get this this increase in test performance kind of that seems to come out of nowhere. Now, yeah, this was training on 50% of the data, not 70%, 50% of a modular division task, I think a really big one. So we now know a little bit more about this grokking hypothesis, as it's known, this grokking effect, as it's known. The model is actually learning some useful embeddings in this period. Okay, it learns specifically the cosine and sine decomposition of the inputs integers. So it learns to perform those, and it's pretty cool. There's follow-up papers that have illustrated this, but it kind of like, and that's useful for the addition. It uses some weird trig identity to kind of get that, to get the result of the addition. But like, yeah, it's that it's strange and surprising that there's this long kind of lag between these two. So the question is, if you were to train participants on a modular addition task, or where they were learning something like this, and you could kind of replicate this, would they use their spatial memory system? Would they show this long and would they show this long lag between memorization and generalization? Any questions before I move on? Okay, this is basically what I've just said. So yeah, can humans learn to generalize abstract conceptual relationships from these small algorithms? I added a third research question because 3 is a nice number. Do humans know that? That's the main one, and kind of is the spatial memory system learning these map-like representations. I'll explain what I mean specifically by map-like. So this was the task. We weren't going to actually train them on addition, modular addition. What we did is we generated this kind of abstract game that people could use on their smartphone over a number of weeks. So I think, it was usually about the minimum training time was about 6 weeks that people were doing this over. Our participants were amazing. They were all really, really good. Like, it was a big task, and we only paid them £100 for the training and an MRI scan at the end. So, they really helped us out quite a lot. So what the training involved was you saw this array with 2 images in a sequence at the top, and then this little squiggle, okay, which kind of implies unbeknownst to the participants, it's like a modular addition operator, or an equal sign or something like that. And what you have to do is you have to select which of these images in the lower array the way that we put it is that they have to complete the sequence, or what comes next, or something along those lines. We didn't kind of give any explicit instruction. Really, we just let people go and do this and learn. There were 2 types of problems that we trained. So supervised problems, you have you have up to 6 attempts to select the correct image from this array in the bottom. Each time you get an image, you make an incorrect choice. It's just your choice is surrounded by a red box, and you can choose again. And then when you select the correct answer, you get this green box. And then there are these unsupervised trials where you don't get any feedback. You have to make a choice, and you just get a blue box around that chosen image, and then it moves on. So we're testing continuously during training, but you don't get feedback on the full set. Those unsupervised trials, they're we suppress their frequency. So most of the training was focused on supervised, but we get good measures of generalization performance throughout the training procedure, throughout that 6+ weeks, whatever it is. And yeah, I should mention that obviously each one of these images is assigned an integer value. The participants don't know that. They have to kind of learn the rules. So this is the grid that we use. The grid was the same for all participants. So every participant had the same allocation of problems to either supervised or unsupervised. And the unsupervised were these ones in darker colors. But we actually separate them out into 2 or 3 types. So there's hard type, there's an easy type, a very easy type, and a really hard type. The hard type are what we call non-commutable unsupervised, these in black. So the only way to generalize these problems is by really just learning the structure. You can't use any other heuristic. And probably the best way to see that is by looking at the others. So commutable unsupervised, 0 + 1 is unsupervised, but 1 + 0 is supervised. And because modular addition is is commutative, commutable, it doesn't matter what the way round those two integers are. If you learn the symmetry for any subset of the supervised, you can kind of very quickly generalize that to the others. So these commutable and supervised, they're quite easy to learn. People pick them up quite quickly. The non-commutable, though, you can't rely on that heuristic either, because the mirror is in the unsupervised, or they're on the diagonal. Is that so? To our first question, basically, do people show the grokking phenomenon? I'm not going to explain the model in detail, but I can answer questions about it. We generated this model because nothing existed before that could kind of model this data, the training data. And there are some other follow-ups that we've done, but so what it involves is basically using a soft plus function, because what you want to say is that there's been, if I go back to this period, right, you've got a long period of nothing happening in performance, and then all of a sudden the network has to, your model has to predict a learning increase. Okay, that's an inherently, I didn't realize this at first, but it's an inherently nonlinear problem. You can't just use logistic regression for that, because logistic regression, your predictor, your training predictor has to, predict some monotonic increase in performance or decrease in performance as a function of this training steps predictor, right? So the whole point of this model was to use the soft plus function to model two things. This A parameter is the point in training. So how many times people have seen all of the stimuli, for instance, where they start learning, their performance goes up on any set of any type of those trials. And then we've got also this learning rate parameter B, which is just the slope of that learning gradient. And we fit this model, it's a hierarchical model. We fit this model to all of the data. It actually uses all of the attempts in training. So it has a sequential kind of selection model in the likelihood, so it can kind of like it can predict the sequence of correct versus incorrect responses on each of the trials. But this is what we get from it. So we've got here the supervised trials over here. This would be the A value. That's the learning onset for this curve. And there's one line here for every participant. And you can kind of see that you've got some varying slopes and things. For the analysis, we divide all of these, the problems up into 4 mutually exclusive types. So supervised trials, you've got these 0+ trials. We figured that you had to do this because participants just learn those 0+ questions really quickly. To kind of like illustrate that, anything plus 0 is the anything. X plus 0 is anything, right? So it's the identity for this problem. So people learn that really, really quickly. And that's reflected in these learning curves. The learning onset is extremely low and the learning rate is very rapid for pretty much everyone. I don't know what these people were doing. But okay, and then we've got these unsupervised commutable pairs and then unsupervised non-commutable pairs. Now, it took us a little bit of time to figure out what our hypothesis was here. And we revised it a little bit. If you think about it, you can't just compare the learning onsets. You can't compare the learning onset of to test the grokking hypothesis, the learning onset of training to the learning onset of generalization, because of course they're going to be, right? The hypothesis is that memorization, which is this point up here, is different from the onset of generalization. So what we have to do is we define a point where we say that participants along these fitted learning curves, where participants have truly memorized their set of supervised questions, and then we compare them to the learning onsets of all of those other types that I showed you. So all of these. And these are the statistics for those tests. And you'll notice that all of these betas are negative. Okay, so all of these betas are negative. What that means is that actually generalization precedes the memorization points that we defined. So people started to show performance increases on all of these different trial types before they fully memorized the supervised set. By the way, the memorization point that we chose, it doesn't really make much difference, but we chose about 0.99 accuracy. So the accuracy basically had to be up at that plateau. And when you do the comparison between that memorization point and the learning onset, maybe these guys are not super surprising, the 0+ and the unsupervised, but the unsupervised non-commutable pairs, there is still those onsets actually precede the memorization point still as a group. Now, there's a caveat to here. So you notice that many of these lines are going down to 0. And the reason is because only a subset of our sample really generalized fully the problem. So these 5 people, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people who really, really understood it and got it very well. There were these guys who were very well on their way, so they're kind of in the middle, and there are the rest of the group who kind of show this, you might think, like anti-learning. The reason that happens is the reason that happens is that people tend to settle into a strategy where they just choose the wrong pair, and then that's them done sort of thing. And the grokking hypothesis, this beta, which essentially goes against that idea, is only applying to these people, these strong generalizers. It kind of speaks against it. Now, there's a caveat here, right? If we had just left these people to train for long enough, their performance would have gone up. And actually, then, the hypothesis would be valid and true for this subset that in this plot haven't learned. We don't know, and that is a genuine possibility. In fact, when I first ran a very simple neural network model on training, I was so surprised at how long it takes. It's, this graph is it's got a log, it's got this, log axis, but it really is extremely, the lag is extreme. It is very extreme. And, I think that it is entirely possible that these people will learn after a while. I don't know though, that's something to kind of talk about and consider, or maybe study in the future. But that's the kind of I would say partially falsified the grokking hypothesis. Yeah.
Did you look at what those people were doing in terms of, did they think they understood something, did something systematic, or did they start giving up and just doing more random?
It's a really, really good question. So, you mean the people who didn't learn?
Yeah.
The people who didn't learn, they memorized the data sets really with everything was fine. But it wasn't really that they were giving up. They were all definitely trying absolutely very, very hard. And there was nothing that we, could separate. They were all dedicated participants. It weren't giving up. They didn't happen to come across the strategy. One thing that we did do is we asked everybody whether they saw after. Well, I didn't do this, but Sophie asked. She interviewed all of our participants to try and get a sense of what their impression of. Did they learn some circular structure that they could verbally communicate to us? And even the people who are the strong generalizers couldn't do that so well. Now, there was variation there. Some people could express a rule or something that was kind of, if you squint or you read quickly, it's kind of like the modular addition rule, but others weren't able to do that. One of my friends, basically, who was a strong generalizer, just basically said, I figured out that I could do what I was always doing, as in, like, I had been doing this thing to the supervised questions, and it suddenly just clicked for her and she could do it. And so we really don't know, and I don't think people can really express what the rule is the way that their confidence in expressing those rules is actually completely uncorrelated with their ability to do this. So yeah, partially falsified. Now, okay, we thought that maybe the spatial memory system is learning this these representations. So I'll cover this very, very quickly. What we did was we actually generated two models of the data. In this model that I've described so far and I've been presenting the results of, the observation model, it assumes that people are, when they make a mistake, it uses the von Mises distribution, which is a circular distribution. So it assumes that your responses kind of narrow in as you learn to the correct answer. And it allows for the fact that people could kind of have a near miss incorrect response. So if the correct integer was 5, then a near miss would be 0, because that's next to 5 mod 6, or it would be 4, because that's the other side of 5. Right? So that's the soft plus von Mises. We also fitted a soft plus binomial model, which is just modeling the data as correct versus incorrect. And the question, I thought this was a fairly neat thing to do. The question is, does the soft plus model, this model that actually explicitly encode, soft plus von Mises distribution, does this model that explicitly encodes the circular structure of the task actually explain the data better than the binomial, which just predicts binary correct versus incorrect, i.e. a hit or no hit? And the answer is that the binomial model works better. We pre-registered the von Mises model, but the binomial model actually, across all, I should have put the standard errors on here, but across all of them, the binomial model is better for strong generalizers and for our weak generalizers. You'll see this axis come up quite a bit. There were 6 of those really hard non-commutable problems. And so to produce a covariate that kind of expresses how good people were at those, we just summed up the model-derived probability of a correct response across all of those 6 problems for each people. So these people are 5 really strong generalizers. These are the guys who are kind of in the middle, and this is the rest of the group. And you'll see this axis quite a lot. Okay. So now to the question of, can we detect representations in the brain that corresponds to this circular map that we've taught people to use or something like that? And what we did here was we got participants after their training, their 6+ weeks of training, we got people into the fMRI scanner up at CISC, and we got them to basically rehearse what they had learned across all of these across the entire training run. So they saw, we call these stimuli sparks to our participants just to give them some name. But we kind of show one image for 3 seconds. We have a random interval so that we can kind of decode the response of this image. And then we show this second image, and all the while we're recording brain activity and participants can make a response. Now this period over here, this is the symbol that is the modular addition operator. And this symbol here is just an arrow that could either point that way or that way. And what that was doing was trying to prevent people from pre-computing the answer when they saw this B. Yeah, because if you imagine in someone's mind, their task is to do this modular addition. They could be, by the time they see B, they've got enough information to pre-compute C. We don't want the neural response at B to be correlated or kind of confounded by B. So this is just a protection for that. And then they scroll through the images in the scanner to select their thing. These were our pre-registered hypotheses. So the pre-registered model. Now let me explain this because it will be it will make everything make more sense. So we have this modular structure, this circular arrangement of those stimuli that we're expecting to see. How should that be expressed in the brain? Well, if you extract the patterns of activity in one of these brain regions, you get, and you kind of vectorize it, you get this long list of intensities for, what does the brain look like when a person is seeing that particular image. And then, as I mentioned, you can kind of take the distance of that, the distance between, the correlational distance between that vector and the image, when the brain image, when someone is seeing a different stimulus. So you can do this pairwise similarity, look at the pairwise similarity matrix of all of those different stimuli. And what we hypothesized was that if people are really encoding this task spatially, then what we would see is there should be a very small distance between, say, 0 and 1, those stimuli, because they're next to each other. There would also be a small distance between 0 and 1. I've put this as similarity because that's usually what we work with the MRI data, but it's the opposite of distance, basically. So there should be, these are large they're small distances, large similarities, and then that distance drops up to a maximum of 3, so 0, 3, and then it kind of goes up again. So that's what we were expecting to see. And we looked for this, we looked where the representational structure in all of these brain regions that we pre-registered matched that very specific structure, and kind of like, could explain the data according to this very, very particular structure. I should mention all of the stimuli, all of the images, they were randomly assigned an integer. So we're not getting any visual effects confounding this analysis. They were randomized across participants. And then we looked, our pre-registered analysis looked for effects that kind of corresponded to co-location. So co-location is whether you get a difference between that match to that template and when you're comparing A versus A or B versus B. So if I call this the A stimulus and this the B stimulus, you can look at the pattern similarity of A versus A, stimulus A versus stimulus A, or stimulus B versus stimulus B, or you can look across stimulus A and B. Now, initially, we didn't think that there was going to be this generalization across these two positions was trivial. The same neural codes that you'll see here will also be used for this stimulus, but kind of that didn't end up being the case. So this co-location predictor ended up being quite important, which is a surprise. But yeah, I'll talk about that in a second. We also looked for effects that were affected by hemisphere. And this predictor here, this P non-com, is basically your performance on those really hard generalizations. So does this representational structure depend on this performance of whether you're a strong generalizer or not? It's essentially binary. Now, all of our pre-registered analyses that had that model did not survive. But we were quite encouraged when we saw the histogram of that pattern match similarity. So this is how much does the neural data adhere to that hypothesized similarity effect. You can very clearly see that there's a nice little bump excess here in the predicted direction for some of our regions of interest and some of our conditions. Okay, there was nothing really to mention at all in all of the pre-registered analyses. But what we did, we started to do exploratory hypotheses. So we just changed this model very, very slightly. We looked for regions where pattern similarity was explained by the interaction of these effects. Just by turning those pluses into multiplications, we can look for regions that actually show an interaction, or some of these effects that aren't quite hypothesized. And these are the effects that we saw. So in the anterior hippocampus, which I remind you is part of this spatial memory network, we found that so Z template, this Z pattern match similarity, this is any region in any one participant that kind of respects that modular structure that our hypotheses are bearing out. So higher values up here are hypothesized. Lower, like values around 0 are not hypothesized, are indifferent, and this is the opposite direction. And here we've got that summed non-commutable performance again. And what we found was that you get this modular structure only in the strong generalizers, and only when you're looking at representations that are specific to A versus A or B versus B. Yeah, those, in other words, the brain treats position A as being different to position B in this problem. They have different neural codes. As I say, I didn't expect that was going to be the case, but it really does seem to be the case. If you look at the representation in these learners, at this point, including this person, you see a modular structure kind of consistent. This is a multi-dimensional scaling of these similarity data, and you can kind of see the hot diagonal kind of going on here. In the weak generalizers, it's kind of interesting. The same thing, 0 is different from everything else. And if you remember, the 0 plus problem is kind of special. So you kind of you can see that reflected in the weak generalizers, whereas the strong generalizers have learned a different representation. We see essentially the same effect in another region that is exactly predicted by the theory. So both of these regions are predicted exactly by that model of spatial navigation and concept learning that I talked about before. I was really surprised. I thought it had to be wrong in some sense, but again, we pretty much matched the predictions of the model. The only real surprise was this idea that the codes don't generalize across place. That's barely worth a mention. It doesn't survive. I will talk very, very quickly, finally, if I've got time, about another hypothesis, which we tested, and I genuinely don't know what to make of this. If you have thoughts, I would be happy to hear them. This hypothesis, we chose a field size of 6 for our modular addition problem because it has 3 unique distances other than 0, okay, in its distance 1, 2, and 3. So the idea is we could test a hypothesis related that's never been tested before in this conceptual space idea, which is that the hippocampus actually contains a functional gradient where this posterior regions of the hippocampus at the back of the brain, they encode positions in space really precisely. So they have neural populations that are really, really picky about whether you're standing here or you're standing here. Whether you're standing in which part of your space you're standing in. Whereas in the anterior portions of the hippocampus, the neural code generalizes across space. There's, for instance, one code that says, "Oh, you're at the University of Sussex, not Brighton," for instance. So this functional gradient is suggesting that there's this hierarchy of almost like a place generalization. You get more general and generalized codes the further down this hippocampus you get. Now, this has been shown very convincingly in rodents and people for physical space. And there's all of these studies that have shown age of development effects in humans, but it's never really been shown in a conceptual space like the ones that I've been talking about. So the reason that we picked 3 distances in our modular addition problem is because we could kind of explicitly test for this, right? If we imagine, now bear in mind that we only found our hypothesis in the anterior portion of the hippocampus. Okay, so that's one thing to bear in mind. We only matched our hypothesis there. We only found these representations in that region to begin with. But we nonetheless pre-registered this and went along with this. So this is the analysis that we had. We pulled out the similarities corresponding to a distance of 1, distance 2, and distance 3. And we averaged them all together within those things. We're doing this for, we're actually pulling out the similarity of the data, or the distances of the data, in small spheres along the hippocampus long axis. So we take a sphere of 3D voxels, of pixels, and we kind of compute one of these distance matrices, and then we perform this averaging, and then we sweep that sphere across the whole long axis of this hippocampus. And then we fit this long axis model to the data, where we produce this parameter Q. So Q encodes the nonlinearity in the relationship. So if Q is 1, then there's a perfectly linear relationship between distance and similarity in the brain. This is the idea. I don't think this is very good, but that's the idea. If Q is less than 1, then there is a, let me get this right. Then basically the region emphasizes it emphasizes small distances. Yes, it emphasizes small distances. And in if Q is larger than 1, it suppresses small distances. So it's basically distorting the map. This is the idea of what Q is. And the hypothesis is that essentially Q, or we took the log of Q to turn that bounded interval into an unbounded interval, is going to correlate with the Y position in a standard neuroanatomical space. So basically, is there a correlation between that distortion, that geometric distortion of the similarity matrix and the position in the brain? That was the hypothesis. Now, we didn't see anything that corresponded to testing the hypothesis across the whole hippocampus and across all regions. But we did find something rather peculiar. And I don't know whether this is real. It very well could be completely false. It's a strong effect, but I think it might be that we have to throw this out. I wonder what your thoughts would be on it. So what you have is this long axis correlation. If it's positive, it's matching this hypothesis where, positive values correspond to the hypothesis that we've got, where the anterior hippocampus suppresses the differences between small distances and the posterior hippocampus exaggerates those small distances. So that's a positive value. 0, there's no difference, and negative numbers are against our hypothesis. So what we're looking for is points that are significantly above the line, maybe correlating with performance. We see this really peculiar effect where when you look at representations within the same positions, which is where the only kind of comparison where we found these representations, there's maybe something small going on in the right hippocampus when you look at these strong generalizers, but it's completely flipped for the different positions. So yeah, it's the same learners again, but it's only in the left hippocampus. I don't know what this means. I think it probably means nothing, and we should throw it away. I don't really know. It was just too much to ignore. Yes.
Is there any reason to expect differences between the left and the right hemisphere hippocampus?
No, not that I'm aware of. Yeah, not with regards to this long axis hypothesis.
And what happens if you just merge them?
So we did that, and you don't see this because these effects wash out. Yeah, there's some univariate results. If you want to go and check them out, you can. Basically, we found regions in the brain. I'm not going to open those in the interest of time. We found regions of the brain that really do care about this predictor. Essentially, if you're good at the task, your brain lights up a lot. That's not hypothesis, it's just pretty pictures. I'm not going to do that, say anything other than that. So that's basically it. Some humans can learn to generalize abstract conceptual relationships. They don't always show the Grokking hypothesis. Maybe they never do. They don't. University, or I don't know. And the anterior hippocampus and the entorhinal cortex do indeed learn these map-like transitions, map-like representations when the task doesn't imply any relational structure or anything like that. So yeah, thank you to everybody who I've collaborated with, particularly Iva, whose early discussions with this kind of kicked off this whole project. Kate Howland, who I've been collaborating with on various other projects related to this. Sophie, of course, who led the whole thing, and then various other collaborators. Thanks very much. I'm happy to take any questions.
I guess being a visual guy, I'm curious what's going on in the visual system. And that's like, did you do anything like a searchlight analysis over the whole brain to fit your circular model and look for any given voxel? We did indeed. So far, there's nothing. There's nothing convincing. I mean, there is something that there are things that are significant, but so when you the question is, do you see this predicted similarity effect when you just take small spheres and sweep it across the whole brain and just test it? The answer to that is you do, but we're not convinced that they're real yet. Because they're right on the edge of the brain, they only include a subset of the data, and not all participants are included in that contrast. And I don't really know. But then also in regions that we wouldn't necessarily expect to find. In the visual system, we don't see that. What we want to do, and we've not done,
is look for, we can put those images into, you know, a convolutional neural network to get visual representations, right, of them, predicted visual representations. And we want to, just because it will be fun, look for regions that kind of correspond to different layers of an artificial neural network. Maybe even regress, if we regress out those visual representations, then we can look for, in the residuals, we can look for patterns that are hiding. So there's a combination of the visual representations that is masking the predicted ones. That's something that we will do.
I guess what I'm kind of like curious about is that you've given your participants a lot of time to become experts on these particular stimuli, and my understanding of how this stuff generally works is it's while you're learning it, it's all in the hippocampus, and then as you've learned it, you build neural representations in the visual system that have maps of you know, conceptual similarity like faces are all in a face space. You've created a conceptual space for your stimuli. I don't know if in your experiment you had any control stimuli that you showed them that wasn't stuff they had never seen before. Similar images that they've never seen before that you can compare to ones that they have seen.
We didn't, but because of this hypothesis, we actually included a visual cortex region, and we don't see anything in there.
That's quite a medial region.
Yeah, it's quite like you know, we didn't want something that was like V1. Or somewhere mid down the visual ventral stream, you might expect to see kind of representations that are, as you say, long-term learned representations kind of being consolidated. As it turns out, we didn't see anything in there, and this was a very large region, so we should have. I think that the lesson is that these maps, if they exist, they really do you have to really learn them a very long time until they kind of get consolidated to the rest. I think that's a valid guess, but we will be doing further searchlights to try and see. Yeah, it's a good question. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, so you didn't find grokking, so you didn't find his memorization, delay, and generalization. What did you find? Did you say that you found some kind of evidence of generalization before full memorization?
Exactly. So you know, on this hard set, which is the only really interesting one, the really hard set, these performance increases actually precede full memorization, which is these plateau points, by about 43.8. This is an average 43.8 training rounds. So the training rounds is you've got to see the entire set of supervised questions. So if you imagine, it's the average number of times you've seen that a supervised question, basically. That's basically it. So we humans use it. Now, you can interpret this in several ways. One of the hypotheses that relates to the models that the neuroscience models that I've been mentioning says that if you've learned a circular structure before or something like that, you can reuse that model for new stimuli. So it could have been that participants have learnt the underlying connectedness of this space somehow in some previous task or whatever, and then they've co-opted that pre-existing representation to this new task. And that might be happening, I don't know, but it might explain why people learn things very, very quickly. I don't know, or they just genuinely learn these spaces extremely quickly. I don't know. Yeah.
I guess on that, I mean, was there any, strikes me that someone who's good at reading maps or, you know, or good at visualizing things, like the opposite of an aphasic person, I guess, people who have good mind's eye might do better at this. Did you sort of probe that sort of side of the?
We didn't probe that. It's possible that we could look into that and follow up. We've got permission to email our participants still, so we could do that.
Yeah, an IQ test.
We didn't do any of that. No, we didn't. We didn't take much in the way of that sort of stuff. It's a good thing.
About this one here where they all go to zero, I guess they just settle into doing the wrong thing every time.
Yeah.
They're convinced or assume that they're right. I guess they're getting no feedback to say at the end of the session, you're still getting it wrong. We're not telling you why you're getting it wrong, but you're still getting it wrong.
They didn't know.
So they have no motivation to prove or to try mixing things up.
Exactly.
And that was good.
Yeah, we didn't want to give them any clues. We didn't want to give them any clues as to what they were doing. We wanted to just do this task.
Test it.
Yeah.
So why did they either always go to 100 or go to 0? Why didn't some of them
Well,
settle on?
that's a good question. The kind of the model, once you've triggered the learning onset, it has no option. It has no option but to drive, the predictor drives the predicted response to some extreme value given enough time. So it's kind of an artifact of the model. But in truth, they really do actually settle down into one thing or another. People very rarely, like they're very experienced in this task by the end of it, so they very rarely flip between responses.
It was even like we've partially learned the models. That's not possible.
You can have like partial learning where the model is predicting that someone is unsure, but if you're past this point where the model has said, oh, now you've actually acquired some knowledge that will drive you towards the ceiling or towards the floor, it has to predict that given enough time, it will go. It's like a logistic regression is kind of the same in some sense, right? If you've got a linear predictor, you've got a predictor that predicts performance changes over time, that you can't make that predictor just do a U-turn at some point. There is a way to, like, the state space models would be able to do that, but we didn't want to we wanted a simple, relatively simple model for this. Yeah.
What do you think would be the influence of having a second operator rather than just doing addition in this task?
That's a really good question. I don't know, and I want to look at that. So I think it might have been an oversight in some sense not to have a subtraction. So you could go the other way around the circle. And our initial thoughts about this was that it's doubling up the problem set, some sense. And also subtraction is not commutative, is it, right? So, it's kind of a harder thing to learn. So that's one of the reasons that we didn't do it. But it very well could, even though it's an interesting problem to ask for humans, right? And I'm not sure what the answer is for neural networks, but for a transformer. But if you're expanding the problem set that they're having to learn, but does that actually make it easier to learn the structure? I don't know what the answer is. I think that would be a really, really cool follow-up.
I think we should probably. Yeah.
How accurate was this model in predicting?
It was really, really, really accurate in the end. How do I describe the accuracy? I've not got any statistics for you on the whole, but it did a very good job. Although this is still the von Mises model, the binomial model, is better, but it predicts its accuracy at predicting performance is really good.